So what, if, or how rather, does this analysis help us understand human beings' atrocious propensity to be brutal to those that are different than themselves? And here Becker offers us two really, I think, profoundly stunning insights in another book with evil in the title called Escape from Evil. All right, now Becker says, look, if in fact I'm right, if your beliefs about the nature of reality serve a death-denying function, then there's two problems. Problem number one is what happens when you encounter someone who has different beliefs. Right? Becker's point is whether you're aware of it or not, the very existence of an alternative conception of reality is fundamentally threatening. Because if you believe something, let's say that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a well-deserved break on the seventh, and you run into, let's say, someone from the South Pacific where they believe that the earth emerged from a giant coconut shell out of the side of a palm tree, well, there's a problem. Because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you do so necessarily by undermining the confidence with which you subscribe to your own perspective. And when you do that, you expose yourself to the very anxiety that your beliefs were constructed to reduce. Does that make sense? That's the closest thing to a technical thought that I have. So I'm going to actually say that again because Becker is very clear about what's happening theoretically here. If your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function when you run into somebody who's different, that's problematic. Because if you accept their beliefs, you necessarily undermine the confidence that you have in your own. When you do that, you expose yourself to the very anxiety that those beliefs were designed to ward off. And when that happens, it instigates a host of compensatory psychological mechanisms that are designed to restore your psychological equanimity. All right, so that's point number one, is that if Becker's ideas are true, then we're going to have a problem when we run into people that are different than ourselves. All right, point number two is in some ways even more gruesome and discombobulating, because what Becker goes on to say is, you know what? Even if there weren't different people around to annoy us, we would designate somebody as different because we have to. All right, well, his argument is as follows, as articulated in the Escape from Evil book. What he says is, look, no matter how powerful and convincing your culture is, it is ultimately a symbol. All cultural constructs are symbolic. They're human creations. All right. However, death is a very real physical phenomenon. And the point that Becker makes very simply is that no symbol, regardless of its power or potency, will ever be sufficient to overcome the physical reality of death. It's like mixing apples and oranges. Consequently, and I've got to degenerate into some psychoanalytical language, which is probably okay for some, less so for others. What Becker says, again, borrowing from William James, he says, you know what? Therefore, no matter how good your culture is or how much you believe in it, there's always going to be some residual anxiety about death. And you're not aware of that, he claims, because that anxiety is repressed. And then using Freud's ideas, what Becker says is that repressed anxiety is projected onto another group of individuals, either inside or outside of your culture, that you designate as the all-encompassing repository of evil, the eradication of which would make life on earth as it is in heaven. He calls them scapegoats, and I think we're familiar with them. They're either in-house or external ones. Either way, Becker says, we've got a problem. Either you run into people that are different, and that's a problem, or you declare somebody to be different, and that's a problem. Because what Becker then goes on to do, borrowing very heavily from some sociologists that we're very fond of, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, in a book called The Social Construction of Reality, what Becker does, following Berger and Luckman, is to talk about the psychological processes that are instigated when people encounter others who do not share their beliefs or encounter somebody who they have designated as different. I'm going to abridge this list a bit just to get us through the evening and just stick to the basics and talk about three reactions that we're all familiar with. Reaction number one, we call derogation. I think because Berger and Luckman called it that. That's just a high dollar word for berating or belittling somebody. So I believe that God created the earth in 6 days and took a break. Those people in the South Pacific believe that the earth was created out of a giant coconut shell. Was that a problem? Of course not. Those are ignorant savages that live in huts and worship piles of sticks and mud. They don't have CNN or email or beepers, and so no wonder they have such a stupid conception of reality. I'm being facetious here. I'm not meaning to be taken literally. The point that I want to make is that the first line of psychological defense when we encounter those that are different than ourselves is to belittle the possessors of an alternative conception of reality as a subhuman, unintelligent form of life, because once we do that, that diminishes the challenge that their conception of reality poses to us. How's that sound? Does that make sense? A couple of head shakes for an emotional boost. Awesome. All right, thing number two is while we berate these folks, we generally simultaneously try to get them to divest their ridiculous ideas about the nature of reality and to adopt ours instead. I think Berger and Luckman call this assimilation, or we do, I can't remember, but we're more familiar with the term conversion, and this usually happens either politically or religiously. And so the next thing that we try to do is to get folks to drop their ideas and to adopt ours instead. And let's think about this for a moment, because I think this is very important. It certainly is for Becker, because we need to understand what's at stake. Becker's point is that there's a sense in which culture is a shared illusion. And what he means by that very simply is that if we grant that cultural beliefs are human constructions, what we also need to note is that there's lots of different ways to apprehend reality, and there's no absolute way to insist that any one of them is of necessity better than another. How's that sound? Well, as a result, the way that we maintain confidence in our beliefs is by social consensus. So the more people that share our beliefs, the more confident we can be that they're correct. And again, I mean no offense, although I'd be happy to offend if necessary. If you're a single person in the train station in New York City, and anybody who's been on the East Coast are familiar with these types, walking around, it's July, you've got a winter coat on and a big shopping bag full of crap, and you're walking around gibbering how this large bearded guy created all of humanity in his image and the rest of the world in 6 days. If there's only one person saying that stuff, you're going to reach for the bottle of antipsychotic medication and pass it on. You're just going to say that is so maniacal that that's beyond belief. Well, when half of the world has that belief, it's not so maniacal. It's the received wisdom of one of the world's dominant religions. And again, I mean no offense here. The point that I want to make is that if it's just your belief, it's autism. If it's everyone's belief, it's culture. And it doesn't change the fact that one of them is no more or less right than the other. So the point that Becker makes is that we go to enormous lengths to get other folks to dispose of their ideas and to adopt ours instead. I don't want to single anyone out in particular this evening, except to note that Christian missionaries in the United States are the biggest of the converters in terms of religion and politics, respectively. And I think it's for the same psychological reasons. And we can maybe talk about this later on if we need to. The Russians were right up there, but they weren't as good at it as we are. And so they're out of the running these days. All right. Well, next thing that we do, according to Becker, is to just annihilate those folks that are different, thus removing them from the face of the planet and confirming that our God and our vision of reality is the true one after all. As some of you have heard me glibly say in the past, my God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it. All cynicism aside and all silliness aside, the point that Becker wants us to seriously entertain is that ultimately all ethnic strife, all armed conflict is the result of a psychological inability to tolerate alternative, death-denying cultural constructions. Now, let's not be simple-minded. This is not to suggest that there aren't geographical, political, and economic considerations that pervade human conflict. There certainly are. Well, the point that Becker makes, and I've really talked too much and I'm hoping to shut up in the next 5 minutes or so, is that if these ideas ought to be taken seriously, then what are the implications of them for us as human beings in the world in which we now inhabit? And at the end of Escape from Evil, Becker really has some interesting thoughts, one of which I hope is quite wrong, because he wonders at the end of that book if human beings are a viable form of life. He just says, you know what? We have to think about the fact that we may be a giant biological mistake. We are not an incredibly old species. Who's aware of that modern Homo sapiens sapiens, we've only been here for about 100 or so thousand years. Who's also aware of the fact that every human on the planet is descended from a tiny breeding population of no more than 200 individuals? Is anybody aware of that? We're an accident, quite frankly, and a rather young one at that. Bacteria have been here for 6 billion or so years. They're definitely proven their mettle. And other forms of life have been here for quite a while. The human being's not been here for that long, Becker reminds us. And what he points out is that having self-conscious pieces of mortal meat may not have been that good of an idea. In the short run, it may have been good because we have been fantastically successful. But now that we possess the technology to exterminate each other with about the same amount of effort necessary to play a video game, things may not work out too well. It would be arrogant and stupid to proclaim ourselves detached from nature to the point where we have some kind of privileged position that renders us immune from self-imposed catastrophe. And as I've joked with many of my students before over the years, there's a very real possibility in the absence of a radical change in the way that we conduct our affairs, that in a few thousand years, you'll have cockroaches the size of us looking at a few humans in jars of formaldehyde in museums next to some dinosaurs. They'll be going, yo, there's the dinosaurs. There's those people. They ruled for a tiny time, and then they really screwed up, and there they are in a jar. Cockroaches will be fine. They thrive on radiation. So when we're long gone, the world will be a better place for the roach. And just like mammals were made